Mr. Wong Kan Singh and members of the Advisory Board of the Singapore Forum, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me. It's my privilege to be speaking to you. It's a very distinguished audience. I noticed as I came in a remarkable number of former ministers from China, India, at my table alone, China, India, Thailand, Indonesia, 4 former ministers from Singapore. Indeed, my speech is really a battle against a truism in every country, which is that former ministers are wiser than current ministers. And my entire speech is an exercise of this battle against this truism. But thank you very much for inviting me. I will talk about a few things that I think are on all our minds. I think we are at a very unusual period in global affairs, regional and global affairs. Very unusual period. It is marked by fragility as well as opportunity. Fragility of a very complex nature, because it is fragility in the economic sphere, fragility when it comes to jobs and incomes, particularly the incomes of the middle class all over the world. Political fragility, as seen in the increasing polarization in politics in many parts of the world, particularly in the most advanced democracies. Social fragility, a loss of a sense of broad-based prosperity, weakening social mobility, a loss of cohesion, particularly in multicultural societies, social fragility, and the fragilities in the security sphere, which many of you are very familiar with. And there's a way in which these fragilities are intersecting. They intersect and reinforce each other. This describes a lot of what is happening in the world today. We can't quite define it. We can't quite define how things are intersecting. But anxiety levels are up in every sphere. Ordinary people feel it. There's a loss of faith in public authorities. There's a weakening of the middle. Something has changed. And this is happening at the same time that we know, and we in Asia can see, tremendous opportunity before us. Most especially in Asia, plus the emerging world generally, and I would say even the opportunities for major rejuvenation of the most advanced economies. Rejuvenation through investments in infrastructure, whether you're talking about the United States or Germany. In most of the advanced economies, tremendous scope for rejuvenation. Rejuvenation of skills, capabilities, tremendous opportunity. So we are beset with the fragilities of today, economic, social, political, security, at the same time that we see tremendous opportunity before us. And for us to realize that opportunity, make the most of it, we have to tackle the issues at the heart of the anxieties that people feel all over the world. First, I think we have to move away from the obsession with monetary policy. If you look at the headlines, everyone is wondering whether a quarter-point move will be made by the US Fed or FOMC. A quarter-point move. Will it be made this month? Will it be made later this year? There's an obsession with monetary policy that has very little to do with the big issues of the day. Middle-class jobs are being threatened by technology. not whether the cost of borrowing is 0 or -1 or plus 0.5. Pensions and healthcare finances are at serious risk for reasons that have nothing to do with monetary policy settings today. If anything, the problem is getting larger because of a long period of very low interest rates owing to the monetary policy response to the crisis. Those are big issues. Will children do better than their parents? A totally new question. You never would have expected it 10 or 20 years ago, but now all the major surveys, the Pew surveys, for instance, show that in both Europe as well as the United States, the majority of parents do not expect their children to do as well as them. What do we do about it in education, in skills training, in using technology to our advantage to create new middle-class jobs? These are the big issues of the day. And the obsession with monetary policy and thinking that the solution to our problems lies in monetary policy is quite wrong and a real distraction from the true task of governments, which is to tackle these issues at their heart. Form a consensus in democracies as to how we should invest, what are the priorities, and move on with it. So that's the first point I'd like to make, that the headlines are often talking about policy responses that have very little to do with the issues at the heart of people's real anxieties. Second, which is both challenge and opportunity, is that of adjusting to the transformation of China. China is a country in transition. You could say it's at an inflection point in two fundamental regards. First, China is at the end of a whole era where it saw the migration of a very large number of people from rural areas into cities, but it was also an era of cheap labor. And China has reached the end of that era. In fact, we're now seeing some of a reversal of migrants from the cities, from the coastal cities, back to local towns where they came from. The Chinese workforce is no longer growing. In fact, starting from last year, it began contracting. That's a major change. They're no longer able to grow by growing their workforce, and wages are going up. Real wages are going up quickly. That's a fundamental change, not just for China, but for the world. A second major change is that China is now becoming a capital exporter. I don't just mean financial capital, but an exporter of direct investment. Starting from last year, China's export of direct investment, its firms investing abroad, exceeded inward foreign direct investment for the first time last year, and the gap increased this year. And this is not a short-term phenomenon. This is the start of a new era, a new phase of globalization for China and the world economy. There's a lot of complexity in what is happening in China, of course, because China is also dealing with very large legacy issues, which greatly complicate its own policy responses. The legacy of an overhang of debts, corporate debts, local government debts, overhang in the property market, overhang in industry, particularly in steel, cement, and other heavy industries. Very serious cyclical overhang that is leading to a slowdown today. And tackling this overhang complicates its strategies of moving ahead with structural reforms for the future. But for all the concerns about China that we read about and we talk about, and which are valid concerns, because these are serious overhangs with implications for China as well as the rest of the world, it has to be recognized that China is the only major economy, the only large economy, which actually has a medium-term plan. Not every country has a 5-year plan, but you've got to have some plans for the future, some strategies, some ways of achieving outcomes 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And unfortunately, we are now in a situation where most major economies do not have plans for the future beyond 1 or 2 years and beyond what their central banks are doing. And China at least has a plan of serious structural reforms, greatly complicated by the legacies that are inherited from the last few years. But if China can implement 60% of what it has set out in its 13th five-year plan, China 5 years from now will be a transformed economy. And that will be an achievement. That will be a real achievement. So remember that. China has the most complex economic policy task of any large economy in the world, but it has serious plans and programs, and there's a lot to be said for that. Even if you don't get it quite right, if you can implement plans decisively, you get somewhere. You get somewhere. So we've got to put China's problems in perspective. It is an economy in transformation. It's complex transformations. It's having to deal with very significant localized unemployment. That used to be an advanced country problem. I mean, you've all read about Tata Steel in Britain. We know about the problems in many other parts of the developed world. The problems just don't go away. Problems in south of Wales or northern Britain, problems in Tennessee or Detroit, the problems don't go away. The economists thought that people move around very easily. You lose a job in one place, you get a job in another place. It just hasn't been happening. Can China avoid that type of experience? Can it avoid what has happened in advanced countries? Hard to say. Hard to say. It is difficult in every society for people to pluck themselves out from what they are used to, the places they are used to, particularly when they are middle-aged or older. So this is a problem for China, but the problem is one that has to be viewed in the perspective of an economy that as a whole, it is still growing at a reasonable rate, still transforming. And if you compare it to the problem that China had in the late 1990s, where 30 million workers were displaced. This was Chu Rongqi's time. 30 million workers in state-owned enterprises were displaced. Today's problem is actually much smaller. Very significant for localized regions. Dongpei or the Northeast, one or two other provinces, very serious problems. And China will have to find a way of dealing with these problems in a fair and equitable way. But that's not the big story. So the really big story that we have to adjust to, the rest of the world, is twofold. First, as China moves out of an era of cheap labor, something else is happening. It is moving up the value curve. What used to be a big bulge in the global labor force, when China entered the global labor force, a big bulge at the bottom, simple manufacturing processes, low-cost manufacturing, that big bulge is now moving up the value curve to middle-skill jobs, and in many of the coastal cities, to upper-level jobs, sophisticated jobs. The big bulge is still there. China is still part of the global economy, and it is now competing with the middle class everywhere in the world. How do we adjust to that? How do we ensure that trade and investment is a win-win, not a win-lose? That's a challenge and an opportunity for all of us. And that's the first major shift. The second major shift that I mentioned about has to do with direct investment, capital export. China is now becoming a significant exporter of direct investments. Its firms are investing abroad. And in the first phase, I think there was a fair bit of anxiety about this. Part of the reason was that China's initial phase of direct investments was concentrated in natural resource industries, and the firms sent a lot of their own workers abroad, Chinese workers in Africa and elsewhere. And this led to some resentment, understandably. But China is evolving. The new direct investments are more broadly based. They are in manufacturing, they are in commercial services, they are in infrastructure, they are in IT, they are in a range of industries. And if you think back to what happened when Japan started investing abroad in the 1980s, there was great anxiety globally, everywhere in the world, great anxiety. Because in that first wave of Japanese investment, you'd see Japanese top management, Japanese middle management. It was very Japanese all over the world. But the Japanese investors have transformed themselves. They're now welcomed all over the world. And I think the same opportunity exists for Chinese investment. Because as Chinese firms invest abroad, base themselves in the United States, in Indonesia, in Singapore, in Europe, they also evolve their management methods, thinking, and skills. And that is itself a benefit to China. So in other words, China is internationalizing its management culture as it exports, as its firms situate themselves abroad. And that's a positive for China and the world economy. But we must also do the reverse. We must also ensure that China remains open to foreign direct investment inward so that we get an interpenetration between China and the rest of the world, where every country feels that it stands to benefit from the tremendous growth in future Chinese consumption, at the same time that China benefits by having its firms in markets abroad, evolving their management methods, and at the same time contributing to economies abroad. This is net a big opportunity. China's evolving towards a country that is exporting capital. But for it to be a net opportunity, it must be two ways. It must be two ways. We have direct investment flowing in both directions, and the rest of the world has both a vested interest in China's stability as well as the ability to prosper from China's growth. So those are two major shifts. They are structural shifts that are here for the long term. And I believe China will tackle the short-term cyclical problems it has, which are very serious problems, in a way that ensures that these structural shifts continue, moving up the value curve, more prosperity for the Chinese middle class, export of capital abroad, but the world benefiting from the fact that China is a growing consumer market. I was just looking at a McKinsey report last night, just came out yesterday. They project from detailed analysis that 30% of the consumption growth in cities all over the world, cities everywhere in the world, 30% of consumption growth will happen in China between now and 2030, next 15 years. And if you add together Southeast Asia, India, Northeast Asia, Asia will represent close to 50% of consumption growth. That's the opportunity. That's the opportunity. So that's my second theme. We all have it in our interests to adjust to China's structural transformation. Not see it as a threat, but take advantage of China's structural transformation. And China has it in its advantage to open up its economy, have more foreign direct investment, and maximize the interpenetrations so that globalization in this new phase is not win-lose, but win-win. My third theme has to do with the anxieties of the middle class all over the world. We see it in the advanced world especially. You're beginning to see it in Asia as well. And at the heart of it has been the stagnation of middle-income wages. It's quite well known in the United States. The median household, or the average household, has lower incomes today than it had 15 years ago in real terms. So it's natural that people feel anxious, frustrated, and it's natural that there's some degree of popular support for some of the most prominent personalities in the current round of primaries in the United States. The frustration is natural because people aren't feeling good. Jobs are being lost, incomes are stagnant. And at the heart of it all is a problem that we've seen almost everywhere in the world in the last 10 years, which is a significant slowdown in productivity growth. Not everyone here is an economist, but everyone knows that you can only sustain middle-income wage growth if you've got productivity growth. We have to pay attention to distribution. We have to ensure that within a firm there's a fair allocation of rewards. But you need productivity growth to sustain income growth everywhere in the world. And it's slowed down everywhere. Last year, I think I have some little bit of information here, but if you look at productivity growth last year, it was quite remarkable because you had productivity growth of about 0.2% in the advanced world, and it was negative in the emerging world. Well, that's just 1 year, but if you look at it over a period of years, there's been a significant slowdown of productivity growth. And no one quite knows why. There's a raging debate over it in the United States and elsewhere. Some people think it's the start of a whole new phase of what's called secular stagnation. There's some others who are more optimistic. They feel that there is a lag. There are very impressive technological innovations, but it takes time for them to filter through to the whole economy. I don't know who's right for now. All we know is that we have had a very significant slowdown in productivity growth. When you look closer at it, a couple of things are very interesting. First, there have been very impressive innovations in individual firms. You see some of them in Silicon Valley, you see some of them in some of the other leading global cities. Very impressive innovations. But the gap between the leaders and the majority of firms in the economy has been widening. Innovations in one firm are not spreading to the rest of the economy. And innovations in one industry are not spreading to other industries. Something has slowed down. The economists call it the pace of diffusion of innovation and productivity. That pace of diffusion has slowed down. Breakthroughs are not spreading from one firm to another, from one industry to another, for reasons that are not fully understood. So those that are close to the frontier are doing extremely well, and we all benefit from their products. If you look at what's happening in your latest iPhone and various other products, consumers are benefiting from it. But it doesn't extend across the economy at large, and as a result, it doesn't extend to jobs at large. So that's changed. And the second thing that's also behind the productivity slowdown is the failure to invest in people. And you see that again in the debate, whether it's in the United States or Britain or Europe, much of the advanced world. There's great anxiety over the skills and capabilities that new generations have as they enter the workforce. They're not equipped to find new jobs. They're not allowed, not equipped to keep pace with technological change. And that's not the way it has to be. We have to work hard, governments, industry, individual firms, individuals, work hard to make sure that technology works to our advantage. It doesn't create a society of haves and have-nots, the digital haves versus the digital have-nots, but that technology becomes a way of enriching every job. And that's going to be a lot of work in every society, starting from young in education, continuing in the workforce, and getting firms in the same cluster or supply chain to work together so that innovation can spread. It's a global problem. The slowdown in productivity has been global, and I would say even in emerging Asia, this is a real problem. Emerging Asia today is underperforming its potential in growth by at least 2 percentage points. Emerging Asia outside of China should be growing by 2% more than it is. And in fact, ironically, the gap is biggest in the country that is growing the fastest, which is India. India is the fastest growing economy, but India is also the economy where the gap between what is actual growth and potential growth is the largest. So everywhere across Asia, Southeast Asia, India, everywhere, we are underperforming in productivity growth, and therefore underperforming in total GDP growth. And we need a comprehensive approach. If you leave it to the markets, things will change very slowly. The markets will eventually restructure, but it doesn't assure us of broad-based improvement in living standards. So it requires some intervention by governments working together with industry, some form of market-friendly industrial policies. And that's, in fact, what we're seeking to do in Singapore. We too have a problem of weak productivity growth. But our problem, in fact, illustrates the problem that is seen in many other parts of the world. If you look closer at Singapore's productivity growth, it reveals both a positive and a negative picture. It reveals a big divergence between one half of the economy and the other. We have an outward-oriented sector of our economy, which is roughly about 60% of the economy: manufacturing, financial services, logistics, wholesale trade, a few other sectors. You put it all together, it's about 60% of our economy, outward-oriented, having to compete with the rest of the world. Whether in Singapore or outside, you're always competing with the rest of the world. And that part of the economy has been doing extremely well as far as productivity growth is concerned. Even past the cyclical recovery in 2010, if you look at just the last 5 years, productivity growth has been well over 3% per year. Very impressive. And then you have the remaining 40% of the economy, which is the domestic sectors: retail industry, restaurants, cleaning, a range of domestic services. When you add it all up together, you've had virtually no productivity growth in the last 5 years. And in fact, in the last 3 years, somewhat negative, a small negative productivity growth. So it's a real divergence. And what we have is a dual economy, an economy of two halves. But whether you see the glass as half full or half empty, we have to make it completely full. And we can. We have to spread the lessons from the leading firms and the most innovative firms to the rest. We have to provide an infrastructure that helps everyone to hop on to innovations and benefit from them. And we have to close this gap between the outward-oriented and the domestic sectors. It's a familiar problem all over the world, that the sectors most exposed to international competition are the ones that keep changing, keep having to innovate. And in Singapore, if you don't, you die. Because we're a small economy without a large market, so you just have to keep adjusting and improving. And we've seen that very impressively. So when people think about weak productivity growth in Singapore, it's actually always been a glass half full or half empty. Part of the economy is doing extremely well by international standards in productivity growth, and another part has been stagnant. We've achieved something in the last 5 years. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this very significant growth in productivity in the outward-oriented sectors. And even in the domestic sectors, in areas like construction, you're beginning to see the innovations amongst the leading firms. But we have to accelerate this process, and that's why we are evolving our approaches. It's good that we've had firms across the economy going up to a new level of use of technology, machinery, automation, IT. But we have to go beyond that. We need more breakthroughs, deeper innovations. We need more disruptors. We need more restructuring, where some firms, unfortunately, have to exit in order to make space for the most innovative firms. And that's our new phase. We call it an industry transformation program, but it's basically about restructuring, M&A, and importantly, having greater collaboration as well within industry, so that small firms can benefit from innovation. And it can be done, because technology is in fact today, not just in Singapore but everywhere, much more of an enabler for small players than it used to be. The big players always had an advantage because technology was expensive, it required large systems to be set up, R&D teams, operations teams, investing over a period of time. There was always an advantage in being large. But today, the technology is giving special advantage to the small. Take two examples. E-commerce is a very obvious example. The technology of e-commerce and the digital economy is allowing small firms to scale up and reach out to large markets, including global markets, very quickly. Just look at Etsy. For those who are not familiar, ETSY. It's an aggregation platform for sellers. Within 8 years, Etsy has got 1 million sellers on it and total sales of $1.35 billion US dollars. And it's one of several such platforms. We have similar platforms in our part of the world, Garena and others, growing very quickly. So technology is a great enabler for small sellers, including individuals. 3D printing is another. It allows small players to prototype new products quickly, within a few days, test bed them, and reach out to a market. So this is a real enabler technology, and we intend to use technology, industry by industry, to benefit players small and big, get them to collaborate, work more closely together. It's not a culture that comes naturally, because everyone is a competitor. But within the same supply chain, we can foster deeper collaboration. And secondly, even amongst competitors, we can foster a culture where firms realize that by sharing in common facilities, everyone can benefit in training and use of technology. That's what we are embarked on. So we are evolving. I think we've achieved something, but we have a gap between the outward-oriented and domestic sectors that is still there, and we have to work harder at it, and we are going to work harder at it. So that's my third theme, fundamental because it's what will ensure that we secure income growth for the majority of our people over the long term. It must involve innovation and productivity. Otherwise, we just don't achieve it. And finally, very briefly, is the fourth theme, which affects us all over the world, most societies in the world, which is that of forging new models of multiculturalism in a world where sectarian strife has now entered a new phase. It is everywhere. Sectarian strife used to be local and regional. It is now globalized. We know that. And in a very curious way, what Europe and some other societies are finding is that the second and third generation of migrants into their societies are now more disaffected compared to the first generation. A first generation that often didn't speak the language, was quite pious and different in their beliefs, but they accommodated themselves very well, and the societies accommodated them well. But something has happened over the last 30 years. Even in the United States, despite the achievements of the civil rights movement, segregation is now more pronounced in American cities than it was 30, 40 years ago. More pronounced. Despite all the advances in the political landscape, segregation in everyday life, where you live, the jobs you have, your rate of unemployment, your rate of incarceration, but particularly where you live, segregation is wider than it used to be. Problem is more severe in France. Problem is more severe in Belgium, where you have more complete segregation. If we don't tackle this, we will not solve the problems that we are facing today. We have to tackle it. We need a new social compact, one that's inclusive, not exclusive. We need labor markets to be open so that the young, the migrants are not excluded. We need a new compact. And that's been, of course, integral to Singapore's approach from day one because we had no choice. We had to forge a multicultural society or we would not have survived. And it's ingrained in our thinking. Continuous work, continuous adjustments, but it's been ingrained in our thinking from the start. But this is a fourth challenge I want to highlight. No easy solutions, particularly when we're dealing with legacies. Legacies don't go away. We have to tackle legacies, and we need fresh approaches, and we need a certain frankness in politics, acknowledging the problems, bringing people closer to the center again, and getting everyone to focus on the real problems. So it's a world of fragility and opportunity. There are ways of tackling the fragilities. We can all take advantage of China's transformation. We can do things to lift productivity and lift middle-income wages. And we can, with time, forge new multicultural compacts in all our societies. I think that's an optimistic note, and I better end there. Thank you very much.